Hey everybody, this is Ian O'Byrne and this is Four Questions For. I'm sitting here with my friend James Willis. Four Questions For is a series of interviews that I put together with experts in the fields of literacy, education, technology, and we talk about some of the big issues that are happening and try to make sense of those big issues. And so it provides an opportunity to sit down with super smart, super cool people and pick their brains. So with that being said, James, you want to introduce yourself, please?
I don't know about super smart or super smart, but my name is James, and I'm a research associate at Indiana University, and I'm happy to be with you today.
Awesome. So one of the reasons why we're here is that you and I, among other places, we've met and hung out and worked in digital badges and open badges. Most recently, through my work with Badge Chain, we've had discussions with you about a number of possible issues that happen when we talk about not only badges and digital badges, but as we bring blockchain technologies into this structure. But before we get into that, it can be confusing and complex to think about blockchain. What I wanted to do is talk about one of the issues that we've seen increasingly pop up in blockchain and in badges and in these discussions, and that is the discussion about ethics. And we see a lot of discussion, a lot of talk about ethics as we try to unpack blockchain and as we try to unpack what possibilities there are for open badges and other stuff. And so one of the things I wanted to do was sit down with you for a little bit and talk about what do we mean by all this? And you've been one of the first people, one of the more vocal people to talk about what possibilities or what challenges or questions are out there. Now, this is an interview that we are recording before you'll come into the Badge Chain community call, and you'll have time to really unpack a lot of these questions and issues. We will have links to all of your materials and to the recording from that call. So this is meant to be an introduction or a primer, a commercial for what we'll talk about later. And obviously there's a lot of dialogue we have to have after this. But how do you define ethics?
It's a great question. I think that the difficulty is that there's a kind of an extroverted and an introverted way of looking at ethics. For example, with extroverted ethics, you think, is this good for society? What impact will this have over people? And the introverted type of ethics, you think, well, what does this mean for me? And what does it mean for my family? What does it mean for my immediate friends, the people that I know? But I'm also kind of skeptical of this view that there's this necessarily introverted versus extroverted view. It strikes me as particularly Foucauldian. And I think that it operates in kind of this weird tension. Rather, to me, what's more interesting is where ethics are in their stasis, or kind of a bracketing of inquiry. So if we're able to take a specific question and we're able to bracket it off and say, okay, let's tease out what are the competing interests, what are the difficulties, what are the inherent problems with this. So I think another problem that we have is that we immediately put ethics into this caveat of privacy, that there's this thing called privacy, or some sort of legalese, or there's these legal issues, some other neat category. But I tend to think that ethics are only properly situated and maybe even effective when they're essentially and especially messy. And by that I mean several things, which I'll talk about in just a second. So typically ethics are broken down into three main categories. You have meta-ethics, which is kind of the moral reasoning, the theory of it. This is probably what you get in school when you talk about utilitarianism and stuff like that. You have normative ethics, which is ethical behavior. What should we do? Kind of the behaviorist aspect of it. And then you have applied ethics, which is typically what most people are familiar with. That's where you have specific actions, where you have criteria for ethical action. That's kind of the in the trenches, as it were. But again, I'm like, I guess, any ethicist, I'm skeptical of those things and skeptical of those categories and wonder if we're not a bit beyond it. And I have to wonder, especially as we talk about education and ethics, if that's really helping us to understand where we are and where we're going. And I think that we need better frameworks to understand and tease out the intricacies of our ever complex and networked world. I mean, the main problem is very central, and it applies to ethics, it applies to other things, is that there's no one person or one organization that has an objective perspective. There's no one person that can say, I know what's right and wrong, I know what's moral and what is not. And we tend to mistake our viewpoints as being the viewpoint. So I think that really functional ethics and ethics where we are today have to meet, in my mind, three different messy functions. The first being pastoral, the second being the technique, and the third being power. So in the pastoral, this is where you have the discussion where you discuss the anxieties of what we're doing and where we're going. I've encountered it, especially in a lot of ed tech ethics. You have like these snappy acronyms and aphorisms and easy ways of remembering ethical action, and I don't think that cuts it anymore. I mean, we're talking about real issues and we're talking about human dignity, and there's a seriousness to it that these snappy little easy to remember acronyms that you memorize like when you study biology and you're trying to remember all the different cell functions. It just doesn't work that way. The second thing that I was talking about, techniques. We have a lot of very complex modern networked architectures, and they all sort of presuppose utilitarianism. And what that means is that we presume that these technologies that we have this inherent built-in design of, as long as it benefits the most number of people, then it's essentially good. And I've tried to make for the argument for several years now that, is that really where we are, or is it more of a form of nihilism in the sense of, our technologies are get in, get out, make money, and the end tends to be making money. And that, I think, is actually much closer to nihilism than it is utilitarianism. And I kind of actively wonder, and this is the dreamer in me, so pardon me for a second, but I wonder if, if we had some sort of ethical technique that was based on something closer to aesthetics, poetry, beauty, music, the sublime, what would that look like? If we were to subtract money out of the equation for just a second and bracket it, form that stasis that I was talking about, what would this really look like? And the third aspect is kind of power. So in this complex society in which we live, and I would actually argue the complex global society, there's not one check on power. At one point this may have been religion, at one point this may have been law, at one point this may have been all these other competing interests. There's no one single check on power. In some ways it's a good thing, in other ways it's a bad thing, but I would argue that ethics is one of the most helpful checks on power. How's that for a long, complex answer?
No, it's good. It makes me think about one of the recent discussions that I've been in has talked about, what in my work with badge chain, like we're talking about blockchain, and I try to explain what blockchain is to people. And there is a lot of, I've been struck recently by, there's a lot of pushback on blockchain because, people will not have any issue with the fact that it had some birth in peer-to-peer technologies. Their bigger issue is the fact that it came as part of Bitcoin and that it was birthed at the same time as Bitcoin. And so I've always been like, okay, why is there no issue, especially when you talk with people in education about peer-to-peer, but there's a huge issue with Bitcoin. And I was talking to a colleague, and he said, well, I mean, part of the issue is that with badges, you're talking about something that not many people understand, and then you're multiplying it by blockchain and Bitcoin, which almost no one understands. So you are, out on your own where not a lot of people understand, but also, as you stated earlier, the nice thing, and you didn't say it this way, but I see the nice thing about ethics as being you need those situations that you can sort of bracket off a situation. And almost like when we do in statistics, you sort of, you partial out as many of the different elements or constructs in there. So we can bracket off this discussion about blockchain, and possibly add in badges, but we can bracket it all off and say, okay, here's the playing field. Now let's look at all of the elements on that playing field, and let's have a real discussion about ethics and figure out what are the roles, what are the powers, where are the power dynamics, who is enabled, who is not, within this structure. So it's interesting thinking about how ethics might play a role in all of that.
Absolutely. So some of the, just as a precursor to what a couple of the ideas that I'm playing around with on Wednesday, for those of us that have studied biblical studies and religious studies, we talk about the Genesis block in blockchain,
Mm-hmm.
right? So this is the first coherent block. Well, Old Testament 101 teaches that Genesis was actually one of the last books of the Bible written. There was so much leading up to it. So modern Old Testament theory thinks that the book of Job, which is a book of massive amount of pain and perhaps misunderstanding, was actually the first book. So I think that there's a direct corollary here that somebody that studied the kind of the various different things that I've studied would see when we talk about a Genesis block. Are we really talking about the first block? And is there a corollary here when we talk about all of the pain and anguish and misunderstanding and all of the I don't know, even philosophical baggage leading up to being able to create that first block? And that's a really interesting question for me.
Do you see, and this is way off the beaten path, but we're right here now. Do you see, you talked about parallels between like your studies in religion and in the Bible and in other texts. Do you see parallels between what you read there and see there and your work in technology? You know, as a corollary, are we unleashing the Book of Job by work with blockchain?
Yeah, that's $1 million question. I think that there are, but I'm very leery of teasing out direct connections. But I think if you look at a religious text, and it doesn't matter if it's the Bible or the Quran or whatever you name it, Bhagavad Gita, you have great narratives that inform millions of people, and they live and they die by these texts. And I think that our technologies, and you know, I'll talk about this a little bit more maybe today and on Wednesday, is that we have to rethink. Every generation has to rethink the narratives in which they live, and whether or not a narrative is even an appropriate way of thinking of one's life. And I think that there are some direct connections between any sort of humanistic study and technology, or educational technology, if you want to be specific. And I think that those connections really are in the value of how we write our life story, and whether that's an appropriate way of thinking about the future.
Awesome. So bringing it back to education, how do we see, you know, or how should we see ethics playing a role in education?
Yeah, I mean, so the problem here is that we have and are producing a massive amount of data. I don't believe in the misnomer of, you know, big data, and I get really tired of hearing that, because the Roman government had big data. They just didn't have the computing power to do anything with it. We're only now reaching the point where we're like, wow, we have all this data and we can do something with it. So in education specifically, we have kind of the problems of gathering, sorting, viewing, and using that student data. And it's the use of it that I think is really where we get into some interesting and sometimes sticky questions. There are complex techniques that we have, statistical techniques that we can use for predicting, and even I would go so far as to say engineering, correcting, even manipulating students. And there are very few, if any, safeguards currently in place other than the goodwill of academic administrators. So the problem really comes down to what happens when we lose sight of what the algorithms were originally set out to do. Especially as we get into machine learning and we get into machines that are able to learn from people and learn from data, and you train them on specific data sets. At what point do you say we've lost control of this? Society operates because people buy into the idea of justice. They buy into the idea of the political and individual freedom. And education has very long operated as the mechanism for perpetuating this idea, and not keeping people in line with it, but perpetuating the future of this idea of political will, justice, things like that. But I think that our technologies are increasingly driven for financial purposes, and to that end can threaten autonomy and can threaten individual freedom. So I tend to think of the, you know, there are multiple roots of the word education, where it comes out of Latin, educatio, but I tend to like the one that means to lead out. So in a way, our education, it leads us out of ignorance, leads us out of, you know, these patterns, these particular ways of thinking that might be specific to our group or to our society or to our family or whatever. And I think that our ethical systems really ought to help students think about how and why their data is used. Should an individual student's data be used to help others? Should it be used to harm others? How much control do they possess over their individual data points? And most importantly, and perhaps most interestingly, and I've got a paper coming out soon with Paul Crimson and Sharon Slade, talking about students as active collaborators in their own data use. Success narratives today are driven by institutions, Institutions determine what the ideology is of student success. And I don't hear the student narratives of saying, well, I'm defining my success and here's how. Because I would venture to say that's different for every student. For some students, it may be because they get the job. For other students, it's because they get into graduate school. But institutions have ways that they define success, and very often those are done through retention numbers and through tuition dollars.
Yeah, it's interesting talking about that. Oh yeah. It's interesting talking about the use and also the viewing of that data. You know, some pushback that I've had over the last week or so is people say, well, that's awesome that you want to have a domain of one's own or you want to build up a student's ledger over time, but you know, what is everything viewable? You know, like what are the challenges with that? We've seen that happen and that narrative play out in technology in the past, in educational technologies. We've seen that narrative play out, and usually it's public perception, you know, perceived or actual challenges with the technology. So as we see more of these educational, you know, technologies come into being, and they're being used in the classroom and outside the classroom, what are some of the challenges when we look at it from that perspective of ethics? You know, what are some of the challenges you see as we start to bring these new educational technologies in from an ethics perspective?
Sure. So a little bit of a backstory to this. One of the highlights of my young career was only a couple months ago, and I made a room full of psychometricians laugh. And I say that because, you know, they may not have the best reputation for having humor. But what I said is that if you want to know what a researcher thinks, you need to ask him or her what keeps them up at night. And then I said, okay, so here's an id-fueled laundry list of my REM sleep. First, got a few laughs. I was very happy about that. But what keeps me up at night is that through student data, we're establishing regimes of truth. And we're using that data to define things about people that I'm not sure that they would define about themselves. And more importantly, I think that those regimes may be increasingly harder to challenge. Specifically with blockchain, and I'll talk about this some on Wednesday. If you put a ledger out there and you have this data residing in a Genesis block and then it's replicated over and over again, there's no way to challenge that or to say this is incorrect. Does a student at some point begin to believe the data about him or her? Or does a student challenge that? Or does a student ignore it? And if those things are known about people and they're findable, and someone is able to go out into the wild west of some sort of blockchain technology or badge chain technology and unearth these things about people, do they believe that data too? Or, I mean, and part of this could be too, like there have been some recent studies that have said that when people interview others for jobs, very rarely does a person's gut actually match the outcomes of how long someone stays in a job. Okay, so if that's true and they're putting so much truth into the data about the individual versus an interview, does the same apply when you add technology to it? So I think too, we think about critical thinking, right? I mean, this is kind of one of our ideologies today is this, you know, all students need to have critical thinking, but no one can really tell you what that means. You know, you get the usual answers of, you know, complex problem solving, you know, all this other stuff. Well, I actually argue, okay, so teach them ethics. Teach them to think ethically, because you're teaching them to think around and through the issue. And that you can challenge a person and challenge these regimes. You can challenge so-called truth through moral inquiry. So we run into very specific problems with ethics. And, you know, I think that on a grand scale, I'm going to make some sweeping generalizations here, but right now we kind of operate in this oh no ethics, meaning that development goes along and it goes along and it goes along. And then at the end, or when you're in beta, someone says, oh no, uh-oh, whoops, you know, is this ethical? The flip side of that is if you start with ethics, you can actually have paralyzing effects. What that means is, so if you're sitting in a room full of people, and just imagine a meeting about a meeting about a meeting, and everybody's tossing around ideas, and you say, well, is this ethical? And yeah, you never get anywhere with it. It paralyzes it. So there are some people who are doing work in this, and it's ethics by design. What that means is that you have deeply ingrained ways of approaching development and implementation that consider some of these very sticky ethical questions as you progress. So you get away from the uh-oh ethics at the end and the, oh, maybe we should or shouldn't do that, paralyzing at the front. But the problem is that funding and funding ethical inquiry. Hospitals have boards of bioethicists and lawyers that consider these types of questions. But in terms of getting funding for ethics, it's sort of like getting funding for studying learning. Everybody thinks they know what learning is as a study and as a science. But when you really get into it, it's like, oh, yeah, maybe we don't know as much about it. It's the same thing with ethics. And people are not willing, and in many cases, to pay for an ethicist. They're not willing to pay for someone who can come in and say, well, let's consider these particular questions. That is problematic, simply because how does this work continue if everyone thinks, oh, well, I'll be able to figure out what's ethical, and I'll see something that is morally, wrong when I see it, and it's just not that simple. So I think that to get back to the specifics of the question, we have to reckon with the fact that creepy data is here to stay, and that's going to challenge our freedoms as individuals. And I think that, we maintain these business models of education, the ideologies of retention, buzzwords like disruption. And instead, I think that we need to reframe our techniques as co-opting our own data points. Let's learn to help ourselves and drive our own narrative. And I'll give you an example of that. There's a modern movement towards this thing called unbundling education. And that is driven, in my perception, a lot by market interests of this very simple equation of education to a job. That's not entirely bad, of course. I mean, there's great potential for human freedom to design one's own curriculum, from individual interest. But I don't think that should be adopted uncritically. For example, some of the classes that I had in college where I'm like, oh my gosh, how am I ever going to use this? Those have been some of the most valuable classes. And I would actually venture to say that many people who have been through a similar, especially liberal arts education, are like, yeah, it's those classes that at the time I had no idea, why am I taking this, that have been the most valuable. So I think that there are some pushback movements to this, by emphasizing vocation. Let's get back to, let's think about our career as being called to it, as being a vocation, instead of just a series of jobs or a gig economy of, I'm going to have 15 jobs before, I finally get to retire and move to Belize. So I think that in some ways that if we think about ethics this way, what we're doing is we're reframing our supposed capitalist or even utilitarian designs into something that's a bit more radical. It's a bit more of okay, so if we want to unbundle it, what does that really mean? And of course, for someone who's studied religion, the whole unbundling thing brings in this whole separate baggage. What I mean by that is that one of the roots of the word religion, religio, is to rebind. So the purpose of religion is to bind people together, pull people back together. So when we say unbundling, the first thing that hits my mind is, we're losing the religio, we're losing this bundled sense. What happens from that? And that's really where the key ethical questions kick in.
I'm really fascinated by your word of art, the regimes of truth. I'm hoping that there's writing out there, or that you really unpack that, at some point.
Not mine at all. It's actually Foucault. This work has been done pretty extensively, even recently by Michael Olnek, and there's been a lot of people that have taken, because it's very powerful. It's a very powerful idea to say, these regimes of truth. But I think and one of the reasons why it's so powerful is that it's still directly applicable and it's still very useful to the situation that we're in now.
Especially the word regime, and slowly I'm seeing, not as much as I believe we should, but you're seeing more philosophy and ethics being brought into discussions now that we see autonomous vehicles. We have dialogue about, okay, they're coming down the street and it's either the two children or the nun on the side of the road, which way somebody's going, That's
probably the problem.
Yeah, exactly. What's going to happen here? This past week, Google announced that, for their AI and machine learning ventures, they've got a big red button that basically makes sure that Skynet doesn't finally go operational. And so we're having a lot of talk, or at least on the surface, about, the underlying power and truth behind all of this. So for the normal person out there, the normal person that is not thinking through Merkle roots and trees and blockchain technologies, the normal person that's not knee deep in all of this, for the classroom teacher, for the higher ed instructor, for my colleagues that are researchers, for even people that are developing, for those of us that are thinking about developing with these blockchain technologies or just building technologies, what are some considerations or perspectives, or what are a couple like guiding questions that we should have? And as we're engaging in our day-to-day activities, should we ask ourselves to wonder if we are being ethical in our decisions?
Yeah, so in my opinion, human dignity should reign supreme, and that should be the central question of educational ethics. And I mean that in a very theoretical, also a developmental, and also in our learning initiatives, that human dignity should be this kind of permanent tension between the desires of the individual and the needs of the society, which, again, for those of you listening to this, is utilitarianism. But I actually want to push this a little further. I'm going to go further than that. So if we consider the role of technology in our lives, humans have always had to negotiate and renegotiate our tools. I mean, that's part of human life on Earth, and always has been, is this negotiation and renegotiation and struggle with our tools. And educational technology is no different. But I think that there are some major changes afoot that would make our technologies different than tools that we have had in the past. For example, like any change in specific human tools, we adopt them and we don't look back. I mean, we don't go back to the Gutenberg press. And the problem here is that educational technology has the potential to affect every single person on the planet, and very soon. Now, granted, there are some places that that this will take additional time for implementation, but it will and can happen very soon. So I've begun making this argument, I'm not alone in making it, is that there is a great inequality that is on the immediate horizon. And this is something that I think will apply in our generation. That I believe that in the near future, most people will be educated by machines. And I mean machines in the sense of there might be a person kind of at the helm, sort of like air traffic control, but I believe that machines will lead teaching in most teaching initiatives. And a few people, the wealthy and the elite, will be educated by people, kind of the old way of teaching and learning. And I think that this will cause a massive disparity in our society. And I think that that's something that we need to begin really thinking through now. And there's some direct applicability to things like blockchain technology. But I think that this will be a massive problem that we will have to reckon with in the next 20 to 30 years, if not sooner. So the risk in this is that we could surrender our autonomy and our individual worth, and that we would have machines, programs, etc., determining what we as people can do or can't do. The reward in that is that we're learning how to create our own stories. And this is important in an increasingly chaotic, complex, and networked world. But again, sort of the issue and the bigger question to me is that there's a lot of lip service to student success initiatives. But what if we really put student learning ahead of the market interests? I mean, a lot of these student success initiatives are money driven, they're retention driven. But what if we say, forget that for a second, let's bracket it, let's put it in the stasis, and let's consider what is really best for the student? And I think that there would be a lot of difference. I think that education will look very different if we reasserted the leading out, the embrace of freedom. And the question becomes, how do we help others seize their data? How do we help others realize that there is a massive trove that you can't really move today without there being some sort of data to track you or to determine what you're doing or where you are, what you feel, or any of these other types of analysis that are becoming increasingly invasive in our lives. And for me, kind of the question comes down to, what would education look like if we expected students to be co-collaborators and the measurement of success was dependent on multiple interworking factors, not just retention. So I think that, again, stressing the need to make students take power over their own learning and over their own data and over their own outputs, and to help them to have the strength to build their own narrative of how they define success and not how others define success, kind of becomes the ethical question that sort of subsumes others, in my opinion.
Awesome. A lot to think about, a lot to unpack. I'm definitely thankful that this is the lead in to a longer discussion on Wednesday. And like I said at the very beginning, I think that there is a need to continue to unpack and have these dialogues. These are not easy discussions, but they are discussions that we need to have. We need to, as a community, sit down and talk about what we do to think about the human condition, to think about the individuals, and do they benefit, or do they do we bring them some form of harm in whatever fashion through this? So James, where can people find you online, connect with you online, talk with you? Where do you hang out on the internets?
Oh, no, that's too creepy. I don't have it. I'm just kidding. Twitter is probably easiest. I'm at Willis3James, Willis 3 James. That's probably the easiest. Also, I have a LinkedIn account, but I try to limit social media just because I do find it to be fairly creepy. So yeah, Twitter is probably the best.
Super cool. And what I'll do is I'll put the links in the notes for this, and also connect it over to your materials for Wednesday and the recording on Wednesday. And I also believe that there'll be more blog posts and everything else unpacking all of this. So with that being said, this is 4 Questions For. This is an opportunity to spend a little bit of time with James talking about ethics. In this context, we were talking about ethics and education. We dabbled a little bit in blockchain and badges, but for the most part, we're trying to really unpack ethics. And as we begin this discussion, let's start with a common discourse, a common language, so we can understand what we're talking about when we get to the end. So with that being said, thanks a ton for spending a little bit of time, James.
Thank you.
All right.